Thank you, guys. It's if I get the scissors here, I got to be careful of those. It's thrilling to be here. Thank you. I was at the conference last year, and I'm thrilled to be back to talk to you all. Wanted to talk specifically tonight about hope in an era of polarization, which is, I think, the name of the conference. So how would I depict our polarization today? I'll be blunt. I think our civic debate overall has collapsed to such a degree that we risk not being able to bequeath a democratic republic to our children. And that's a quite serious analysis. If you ask me why that's happened, that was the question that I had. I was wondering, is today's polarization unique? How we've often been polarized in other eras. How would we compare and contrast those eras with today? And it was precisely those questions that led me to leave my business career. My entire career has been in business. I was most recently CEO of Proactive. I don't know if any of you remember that acne cream you might have used. I helped build that brand along with many other consumer brands. That's what I did. I was known as a marketing expert. But a couple of years ago, I left my career for two reasons. Well, first of all, as a citizen, I was increasingly watching as rancor and acrimony crowded out rational debate and discourse. This is about the early Trump years, when Trump first came into office. I noticed how the political discourse collapsed, how this bitterness and malice seemed to replace reason, and the whole ethic of problem solving, pragmatism, compromise, it seemed that was gradually eroded, or maybe not so gradually, from the political class. So, as a citizen, I was concerned about that, but it was not so much that made me start this quest. What led me to write American Schism, which I'll tell you about in a second, was that I watched my peers, fellow CEOs, C-level people, and with great pain, I watched as increasingly they sat on the sidelines. They were afraid to engage. And I'm old enough to know that it wasn't always like that. 35 years ago, I was working with a consulting company called McKinsey, and I was very involved at the time with CEOs discussing important public policy issues. That's how it was 30 years ago. So it struck me as odd that my peers didn't want to go near it. It was like touching the third rail. And it was that made, I said to myself, if the private sector dialogues collapsed, and if the public sector dialogues collapsed, and if private sector leaders won't engage, we're really screwed. I mean, we don't have a chance to get out of this very easily. And I was convinced that there must be antecedents in our history, that there must be more to understand about our divisions, which is what led me to plunge into hundreds of books about philosophy and history and political science. So the book American Schism itself is an investigative tracing of the history of our divisions back to the Enlightenment, our founding. Okay, and the whole premise of the book is that to understand where we are today, why we're so divided, one needs to understand this original schism that happened at that point in the 18th century. And the original American Schism was about two conflicting visions of what America was all about that were vying for prominence. And the book goes into this in some detail. I'm not going to go into that tonight, but I will say that it was so bitter that it became so polarized that we almost didn't get to a constitution. And that story in and of itself is a good analogy and learning lesson for where we are today. But what the book does is it proposes an analytical framework for that time period and then uses that same framework to trace through 5 epochs of our history when we were very divided, when we were polarized, like today. And by contrasting and comparing these different periods, you start to see, you watch as the schism goes through various permutations, you see that there's some patterns that develop. And the bottom line of my analysis, I still hope that you'll read the book, but the bottom line is that there's good news and bad news here. I mean, the good news is that this is not the most polarized we've been, and many epochs of our history have been characterized by extreme polarization. What's different now is how we're dealing with it, or as I say, how we're not dealing with it. So it turns out when you compare the 5 epochs of history and how we dealt with the schism, that patterns emerge, I mentioned. There is a secret sauce. There is a magic formula that we've used with common elements at times, and we've deployed this successfully at times to move past our differences. Now, it's not really magic because it hasn't dissolved our differences, but the secret sauce has allowed us to move forward. And at times when we've abandoned that secret sauce, the outcomes have been very violent and very bad. So there is a history, if you will, can act as a salve for our wounds if only we'd be willing to apply it, if we'd be willing to look at it. So what is the secret sauce? And once again, it's hard to give you a summary of this, but it's basically three things which are going to sound simple. They're simple in concept, and I'm convinced very hard in practice. What are the three things? In order to overcome great polarization in previous periods, we relied on a combination of these three things. The first one is problem solving within an empirical framework where data matters and where emotions don't trump data. So the problem solving overall is number one. Number two, what I call deep listening. Now that sounds trite, let me explain it. It's the desire to really understand other points of view in a deep and empathetic way. It's the way, has anyone in this room, were you in debate club when you were in school? If you were in debate club, you remember you had to take an argument and develop a logic behind it, a rationale, with evidence that supported it, and really understand the position. That's the type of listening I'm talking about. To really have this key element of the secret sauce, that has to become part of your MO. And the third element is a framework of compromise. In other words, a commitment to a process that's driving towards solutions by which you already understand going into it, you will not get everything you want. That has to be a given. So those three things are the basic, in a nutshell, what this secret sauce is. Now, the question is why, what's going on today? Why have we abandoned the secret sauce? Why aren't we using this formula? And if you understand and look at our history, this as well becomes clear. We've allowed, in our contemporary society, we've allowed our primitive brains, sometimes I say our amygdala, is now, we've allowed it to conquer and colonize our political discourse. And the reason why this secret sauce has been abandoned becomes clear when you examine closely the contemporary political landscape, which has underlying incentive systems which are very messed up, to use one of my favorite terms. Let me explain what I mean. Two of the prominent actors in our political landscape today have very counterproductive incentives. The first one are elected officials. Elected officials of both political parties have figured out quite a while ago now that rational arguments don't win elections. That what motivates voters to get to the booth is fear and rage. And kitchen table issues no longer work. And the entire MO is about how to create, in my constituency, fear and rage. Now, why did this turn out this way? Well, the truth is we've always had wedge issues that have been emotional in politics, but it went to a new low because I think of both political parties in the 90s. And particularly when Newt Gingrich took control of the House, there was a policy put in place that was specifically geared towards demonization of the opponent. That was a conscious decision that was made, which both parties played along with. But for example, the tactics that were used were, there was actually a dictionary of terms that the entire Republican conference were to use that characterized the other side of the aisle as enemies, as really evil people. And similarly, I don't know if you remember, this was around the time when C-SPAN first came. And one of the tactics that was used is, Newt or somebody on either side of the aisle would give this long tirade in Congress on TV. And it turns out that there was only one camera looking at the speaker. The rooms were empty. So these tirades were being given as if they were definitive oral presentations of problems, when in fact they were empty room discussions. It was an act. Now, elected officials ever since basically spend their time and money on not solving problems. Their incentive is to not solve a problem. It's to fan flames, because that's what gets them reelected. Now, so that's one set of problems, and I'm going to get to the solutions in a couple of minutes. The other key, you can't really discuss why the secret sauce is gone unless you look at the other incentive problem, which is in the media. The media today has been completely driven by the eyeballs it attracts, by the audience. And in its current embodiment, the quest for audience has completely displaced what had been the center of the journalistic framework, the quest for truth. And the journalistic profession that we spent 100 years building has gotten lost in the tsunami of this new business model. So this is actually very ironic, because if you look at the history of journalism and when it was built as a profession in the 1920s, it was specifically in reaction to the 19th century, which was full of yellow journalism, of using sensationalism. So we kind of went, it's like you talk about, we did this mistake before, we went through this already. And what created the modern profession of journalism was creating a whole ethic around reporting, quest for truth, facts, sources, all the kinds of things that we know journalists do. Now, so what happened? Why is that gone? That old kind of profession? Well, at that time, there were about 200,000 local newspapers in the US, local papers. And that's how journalists learned. They went to journalism school maybe, but they cut their teeth on how to report by working at a local newspaper. And if you were good, maybe you got to write for the Times or the Journal. But that core was how we bred journalists in our country. Guess what percentage of those papers are still operating today? About 8 to 10% are still alive. The rest are gone. So the loss of journalism is a second major problem that creates an environment where the secret sauce can't be used. Now, the result of these two incentive problems is what I call the paradox of the frustrated majority. So you may have heard this before, but we're actually much less divided than it feels, okay? In fact, More in Common has done quantitative research on this, and there's about 70% of Americans who have more in common on substantive issues than not. So it feels like we're more divided than we are because it's the extremes that get the gavel, right? Now, this is quite interesting. Why do I say this is the frustrated majority is a paradox? It's a paradox because, first of all, this group thinks of itself as minoritarian. They're actually in the majority. They don't feel that way. And the second reason that it's a paradox is that it turns out in this group are many of our leading private sector leaders in the country. They're often part of this frustrated majority. And those are the people that have the skills, the skills of problem solving and the skills of compromise and listening that are so lacking that we don't have from the secret sauce. So it's a paradox because not only do they think they're minoritarian, they're silenced because they think that they can't use their skills, that their skills don't matter. Now, you know, I mentioned this was hope in the age of polarization. So I've been talked a lot about the problem. So the hope, in the book, American Schism, I break down the action plan to two types of changes: mindset changes and structural changes. And you guys are all working on many of these problems. The structural changes are things like money in politics, open primaries, ranked choice voting. And then the behavior changes are about how we relate to each other as citizens. So this is the work you're all doing. But the support of these changes is being driven all over the country. There's tremendous hope. There are hundreds of NGOs that I've learned about over the last couple of years as I've gotten into this that are working on this. So many of our fellow citizens are concerned. But there's a hitch. I'm convinced that we won't make adequate progress on these fronts without active engagement from the missing constituency, private sector leadership. And what I do every day, just this morning I was addressing 20 CEOs from Tiger 21 in New York. I spend my time trying to show to private leadership why they need to engage on this problem. And there are many ways to do that. I'm running out of time, but let me just say, I think American Promise as an organization is a great example of one way to do this. What American Promise has done is they've taken not an issue that's based on some hyper-partisan thing, a substantive fairness issue that 75% or more of Americans believe in. More than that. Okay, so a huge amount of Americans believe that I don't know, what's the number, Jeff? It's a lot. The point is that what American Promise has done is recognize in their strategy that the fact that this is such a common held view is both an opportunity, but it's also a challenge because you have to bridge across other people, other constituencies that maybe you don't agree with on many issues. And that's the secret with CEOs. It's explaining to them that 8% of the electorate elects 85% of our House seats. It's showing them that independents can't vote. And you engage them by getting them involved in the process, not on some radioactive issue. And that's the work I do every day. And I think since I'm running out of time, I'm not going to go through more examples, but I do want to make an offer to you guys, which is that, by the way, the approach that you do this with business people is twofold. On one hand, you make the case about how a stable democracy is good for business. That's the business case. But you also appeal to their personal legacy. These are leaders, and they want to make sure that their kids, they're often parents or grandparents, they want to make sure that their kids have the same opportunities they did, especially relating to the meritocracy that we built. So if you can engage them in a way where they get interested in the data, and then you ask them to give money. My second thing is always I ask them to give money to groups like this. And the third thing is to involve them in the process. It takes a little more time. It's like a funnel. You have to move them through. But this is the kind of work that I love to do and that what I thought would be a temporary leaving of my business career has turned into a passion. And I offer to all of you, if you're having trouble or desirous of engaging local business leaders, please reach out to me at SethDavidRadwell.com. Because I will talk to you about it. We can brainstorm. I'll tell you some of the work that I'm doing. And again, I say this because I do believe that we will supercharge this effort if we get the incredible talent of the business community, especially CEOs, C-level people, involved in this fight. Thank you very much.